So what I want to do with you today is sort of step back from that really reactive place where we're just sort of mirroring and imitating one another and try and get a more nuanced evaluation of what we're all talking about, which is who's telling the truth.
Right.
Who do you believe? And so let's just dive in right there and look at the testimony and some of the, I think, really legitimate questions that are being raised about credibility of the witness testimony. So let's start with Dr. Blasey Ford. One big question that comes up for her and for all trauma victims is the question of memory and recall.
Right.
And especially in this case, it's decades old. It's 35 or 36 years old, the incident. So people are asking, how can she remember what she remembers, and why doesn't she remember the things she doesn't remember? So can you talk to us about the relationship between trauma and memory?
Right. I'd be happy to do that. I was a little nervous about this whole program because every 5 minutes the news changes. And it's like, I've been busy today, so how can I keep up? But I did check NBC News, and as luck would have it, President Trump actually talked an hour or so ago about trauma, using the word and saying that Brett Kavanaugh had experienced great trauma. So that places trauma in the vocabulary of persons talking about Kavanaugh and also talking about Dr. Ford. Mm-hmm. So one of the things to help us get at what questions of her credibility in relationship to trauma is, I found it helpful in my work to use the thought of Juliet Mitchell, who distinguishes kinds of trauma. And so she talks about there being weak and strong trauma. And weak trauma is the most common kind of trauma we talk about. So we'll say, I lost my job. I found that very traumatic. I survived a tornado. That was a traumatic. I was divorced. There are episodes in our life that we rightly describe as traumatic. And I think that's probably what President Trump is referring to, that the last 3 weeks, he said, have been extremely traumatic. But the kind of trauma that Dr. Ford is reporting on, and which psychologists refer us to as a deep trauma, which isn't immediately evident, and which really breaches the fundamental structure of the psyche. And the way it does that, and Dr. Ford reported on this in her testimony, is that what has happened to us is usually not available. And so what we have are memory traces in the part of the brain that preserves emotion and feeling. So when we think about her testimony, she talked about what she does recall. So she recalls things that happened to her body, so that she describes the young man who she called throughout her testimony Brett, grinding his body against her. She talked about not being able to breathe with a hand over her mouth. She talked about him moving his hands up and down her body. So she's given words to these experiences, but the initial experience was entirely wordless. It was feelings that she was having, sensations that she was having. And trauma connects to those sensations, and it's only after the fact that it gets connected to words, ideas, and often doesn't get connected to those. That's why she doesn't remember whole bunches of data that would be something you'd actually put on a calendar. It's a body memory. And so her credibility is a credibility of body memories and whether we believe those. And psychologists tell us that, yes, we should, because deep trauma is visible over time, over years, in a kind of repetition of the pain, of the suffering. That's not something you bring to words, but something that is expressed in return of the fright or flight sensations. So that while she talked about describing remodeling on her house as needing 2 doors, what was motivating that was not a recollection of the next time I'm in a dangerous situation, it would be helpful to have two doors rather than one. What was motivating it was the still lived experience of being 15 years old and not knowing if she was going to make it out the door alive. And so that kind of embodied fright is what is very, very credible, because we don't have control over the summoning of those feelings.
Right. Now, part of the questioning that was coming at her was, okay, well, let's accept the reality that you did suffer some sort of traumatic assault, but maybe you're mistaken about who the perpetrator was. How do you address that?
Well, I think that what many persons heard in her commentary is that the suturing, we could say, of those embodied memories of who was touching her was a very strong suture to this particular person, Brett. And so I think it would be unlikely that she had sort of the wrong person in her memory, because those memories, I guess I just like the word suture, is like threaded together with impressions that would be linked to ideation on who was in that room. And another thing that she pointed out was the most powerful experience of all was the laughter, of being laughed at. And so the emotion of humiliation is one that, again, can get encoded in the brain in a way. We can't summon humiliation. Like if you ask me right now, please, I want you to demonstrate humiliation, it's not something I can do. If you ask me to count numbers, well, actually, I can't count either, but probably best not. But you're asking me to express ideas, right? So I can do that, right? So I'm expressing ideas. But if you ask me to summon shame and have my face flush, summon humiliation and have my body expression of that, that's not something that you can do on purpose. One more thing. So one of the persons who's been really influential in my work, her name is Kathy Carruth, and I was rereading for our conversation some of the things she says about trauma and memory, and I think it's extremely insightful given Dr. Ford's testimony, that she talks about when you survive a trauma, a deep trauma, which means that you have some fear of not continuing to exist. And that was her experience. She thought she might accidentally be killed by Brett. Yeah. That what is traumatizing isn't the actual experience, but that one does survive and doesn't know how. And so what becomes repetitive in one's life, why you can't let go, often subconsciously you can't let go of this lived trauma, is not what happened in its specifics as she described them, but the trauma hinges on, I have no idea why I survived, and because I don't, it could happen again until I figure that out. And then your future is foreclosed. I found it extremely interesting that her voice, Dr. Ford's voice, is that basically of a 15-year-old girl. And in some ways, that breach in her psyche, to me, suggests that in some ways time stopped for her when she was 15 years old, and that part of the foreclosure of the future, she did leave everything she knew. She talks about leaving Washington, D.C. and moving to California to start a new life. I'm not sure if she was so much starting a new life as she was moving into a kind of liminal state that has lasted for 30-some years, where she hasn't had a future because she hasn't reconnected that traumatic experience. And then lastly, the last thing I'd say about Carruth is Carruth says, well, how can you break through that? And one of the things she says is that when a victim of trauma actually reaches out to another and connects with them through that compassion or empathy, it can open up the previously closed future. And so I think this testimony that Ford gave, Carruth would suggest there's potential in that for a kind of healing, that a sort of an ethics of empathy that comes through in her very courageous act.